So, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is the American Irish Historical Society. We're delighted to welcome Victoria Millar with us, who is the Senior Curator of History at the National Museums in Northern Ireland, and she has overall responsibility for the history collections held at the Ulster Folk Museum and the Ulster American Folk Park, which those of you I'm sure who have visited have absolutely loved it. And they do an amazing kind of transatlantic look at the experience of Ulster immigrants in America and vice versa. And now this idea of kind of collecting and sharing the folklore is why we're going to speak with you today, Victoria. And we have lots of plans for other collaborations in the future. But today, because of the week that's in it, Victoria is going to talk to us about Ulster ghosts and Halloween traditions from the Ulster Folk Museum's archives. So I'm going to mute myself kind of thing, and then we'll let you take it away, Victoria. Thanks very much. And happy
That's
Halloween.
great. Thank you. Yes, and you. Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for inviting me to speak about Ulster ghosts and Halloween traditions from the Ulster Folk Museum's archives. And as you say, it's very timely because we're just approaching Halloween. Just check. Yep, I can move on the slides. So yeah, just for anybody who may be unfamiliar with the Ulster Folk Museum, it's part of National Museums NI. Which cares for 1.4 million objects in a collection spanning art, history, and natural sciences. And we look after 4 distinct museums in Northern Ireland. So we have the Ulster Museum in Belfast, which you can see on the top left of this slide. The Ulster Folk Museum, which is on the right-hand side on the top. You can see a little cobbled street. We also have the Ulster Transport Museum, which you can see in the bottom left-hand side of the slide. And then we also have the Ulster American Folk Park in Omagh, which is depicted on the right-hand side. Just to get people's bearings as well, where these museums are located. The Ulster Museum is located in Stranmillis in Belfast. The Ulster Folk Museum and the Ulster Transport Museum are located in Cultraw, which is a few miles outside Belfast. And then the Ulster American Folk Park is around 70 miles outside Belfast in Omagh. As Senior Curator of History, I work across our 2 open air museums. So the Folk Museum, Ulster Folk Museum, and the Ulster American Folk Park. By way of a bit of background, the Ulster Folk Museum, the archives of which I'll be drawn upon today, opened 60 years ago in 1964. At that time, the museum had just 2 exhibit buildings, and today we have over 50 distributed across a town area and a rural area, which you can see outlined here on this map. Today, I'll be primarily drawn upon 2 sources held in the Ulster Folk Museum's archives. The first of these is our collectors' books, which were compiled by individuals and organisations across the 9 counties of Ulster in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The purpose of them was to record by county and locality all manner of things, including domestic life, schooling, customs, beliefs, trades, and agricultural practices. The second source from which I'll be drawn upon today is our oral history archive, which sits as part of a collection of 15,000 recordings in our sound archive. As per the title of my talk, the first topic I'm going to discuss today is ghosts, specifically Ulster ghosts, or at least those ghosts which Ulster people are reported to have encountered. The photograph that you can see on this slide is from the Ulster Museum's collection. It derived from a lantern slide and is described in our collections database as a doctored photograph of 2 young men being threatened by a ghost in a lane. Our first story today comes from an oral history interview with an interviewee in Pomeroy in County Tyrone, which was recorded in 1976. The interview here recounts, there was a man and he was riding along the road on a bicycle, and a man stepped out beside him and ran alongside him for about a mile. And he started to get afraid, you see, and pedalled harder. And the harder he went, the man kept alongside him. And he came to a hill and had to get off the bike to walk up it. And the man walked alongside him up the hill. And he said, I plucked up the courage to say, who are you? and he disappeared. The next story comes from a notebook respondent from Limavady in County Londonderry in 1963. He says, "Many years ago, an old man lived in an old house on a lonely part of the mountains outside Limavady. One winter's night, being cold and lonely, he decided to go to bed much earlier than usual. He had only fallen asleep when he was awakened by a ghost who stood towering over his head. When he recovered from his shock, he recognised the ghost to be that of the farmer who lived in the house before him. The ghost advised him to leave the house, but the old fellow refused to leave. To his relief, the ghost departed, but every night after, the ghost reappeared to torment him. Eventually, the old man abandoned his home and went to dwell with distant relatives living in a clump of houses nestling at the bottom of hills. Folks say that the ghost wanted to save the old man from solitude and misery, which he had suffered when living in that same house." The next story comes from the same respondent. They recount, "Once upon a time, there came a woman to live in a house near Eglinton. Shortly after arriving in the house, she saw a ghost. The following night, a man came to visit her, and she told him about her experience on the previous night. He refused to believe her story, but she eventually persuaded him to sit with her and wait for the ghost to appear. At the stroke of midnight appeared a ghost so terrible in appearance that both people fled from the dwelling. As they were running down the lane leading to the main road, the man glanced back to see the house was going up in flames. Only then was the reason for the ghost's visit apparent. Obviously, it was a warning that the house was no longer safe for habitation." So in both those last two extracts, we'll see that ghosts are obviously giving someone a warning or preventing them from living out the same type of life that they had once lived. So almost with a very sort of positive tone to their appearance in front of people, that they're giving them a warning or trying to give them a better life than they once had. Given the widespread beliefs of ghosts and the supernatural, it was not uncommon for people to play ghostly pranks on one another. An elderly farmer who lived near Ballymena in County Antrim told this story to a curator from the museum in 1976. They recall that the farmer had been told his farmhouse was Georgian. It had a reputation for being haunted, but the farmer assured me he had never seen any manifestations and was uncertain as to who the ghosts might be. Apparently the house had at one time belonged to a landlord, and when he died, no one saw his funeral. It seems the story ran that he was buried under the kitchen floor, and he seemed to be suspected of being a ghost. And no one saw his funeral. I got that right, and suspected of being a ghost. I believe it was the idea that the house was haunted, which encouraged a local character, after an evening of storytelling, to hide under one of the beds in the house, and for some time to disturb the occupant of the bed by periodically shaking it. Naturally, the would-be sleeper blamed the disturbance on the ghost. Given all the talk of ghost sightings, just move my slide on, there we go. Given all the talk of ghost sightings, sometimes people could frighten themselves accidentally. The notebook respondent from Limavady tells the following story. There was once a man who owned a hayloft near Limavady. No one would go near this building, as someone was supposed to be murdered there, and his ghost had been recognised by several people. The owner offered a large sum of money to anyone who would enter the loft. One man, when he heard of the large sum of money, went to the owner and offered to climb up to the loft. The owner showed him the loft and explained that he would have to hammer a nail to its floor to prove his presence there. Courageously, the man climbed into the loft and hammered in the nail. But when he started to come down again, something held his foot firmly. Believing it to be the ghost, he collapsed, and rumour has it that he never gained consciousness again. Was it a ghost that had held him back? No, he had only hammered the nail through the tail of his coat. Our interviewee that we've heard from already from Pomeroy tells a similar story. A man coming home late one dark night heard something following him. If he stopped, it did. If he speeded up, so did the pursuer. Turning round, he saw nothing, and in terror he sped home to bed, being chased all the way. He was so frightened, he leapt into bed fully clothed, and there trembling he lay till morning. When in the daylight he looked at his boots, he realised what the problem had been. He had been followed by two long straws, one attached to each of his boots. Moving on from ghosts, let's then take a look at the fairies, who could be also particularly active around Halloween. This photograph of a fairy thorn, comes from Northern Ireland Tourist Board's photographic collection, which is held at the Ulster Folk Museum. It was considered very unlucky to meddle with a fairy thorn, as this next story shared by an interviewee from Pomeroy shows. They say, "I'll tell you about a gentleman. He had a pretty large estate. He was improving his lands. The workmen were digging out stones and pulling out trees, and he said to my father, 'What's the meaning of that land over there?' And he said, 'We never bothered with that. We'd had hard luck any time we'd infringed on the edges or took out any of those stones. It's an enchanted old place.' The man said, 'I want that big tree out. That tree's a nuisance.' So the man was in charge of the men, one of the oldest on the job, said, 'I don't want anything to do with that. If you do 5 or 6 strokes of the axe on that tree, I'll finish it. You show us as an example.' So he lifted the axe and plunged it into the tree, and he said, 'Where am I? Where are you? I can't see any one of yous.' He never got his sight again. Cattle could also be put at risk. An interviewee from Pomeroy recounts, 'In the field, there was a number of big stones. They just looked like ordinary boulders. A good many years ago, the present owner's grandfather decided that these were interfering with the agriculture, and he took them up and carted them into the house. It appears that during the night, the cattle in the byre went crazy, and all I know is that the following day, he carted the stones back down.' Horses weren't exempt from fairy malevolence either. The same interviewee recalls, 'I heard about a man in his farm. There was a circle of hawthorn trees, and he decided these bushes shouldn't have been there. He wanted them out of his road. He cleared the bushes away, and the next day one of his horses went past this spot and dropped dead in the harness.' Some people took the threat of fairies very seriously and took notice when they thought they were making themselves known, like we've seen with the ghosts. The notebook respondent from Limavady tells the following story. An old man who lived in a house on the mountains around Limavady was aroused from his sleep every night by fairies who persisted in tickling his feet. One night, they eventually told him that they would have to leave the house because it belonged to them. Immediately, the old man arose, put on his clothes, and fled across the fields. When he reached his neighbour's house, he told them what had happened, and he swore he would never return to his home again. Some took heed of the fairies a little late. The same respondent notes, a woman lived in Ballinarrig over 100 years ago. One night, she had her baby sitting on her knee at the fireside when a very small woman came in and asked her not to throw water out of her back door. She refused to comply with the little woman's wishes, as she didn't see how this would disturb anybody. Immediately afterwards, things started going wrong in that house, but she still refused to stop throwing water out of her back door. Then a cruel blow changed the course of events. The woman's child became crippled, and the old woman, in an effort to appease the wrath of the fairies, had her back door built up. Until this day, the door remains built up, and people say that the ground directly behind it sounds hollow. Undoubtedly, the fairies lived in this lowly abode. Those who helped fairies were sometimes rewarded. The Limavady respondent recounts, one night, the wee folk called at a farmhouse and asked the woman of the house for something to eat. As the woman was extremely poor, she was unable to provide anything for the hungry fairies, But not wishing to turn them away hungry, she offered them the few remaining handfuls of meal she had in a barrel. Next morning, the woman discovered to her great surprise that her barrel was full of meal, and no matter how much meal she used out of it, it was always replenished the following morning. The fairies were obviously expressing their gratitude to the kindly woman who'd given them all her food. It was important to listen to what the fairies told you, as this story from the same respondent shows. They say, one stormy night, the fairies called at a lonely house in the country and asked a woman to put them up for the night. During their stay, they noticed the extreme poverty in the house. The barefooted children, shabby clothes, the lack of bedclothes, and other household utensils. Before departing in the morning, they told the kindly woman that they would assist her if they promised not to tell any one of her benefactors. Soon, her children were wearing fine boots and clothing, and her home was well stocked with expensive linens and furniture. The neighbours became curious, and one night several came to her home and accused her of being in touch with the devil. The woman hotly denied this accusation and blurted out that it was the fairies who had befriended her. Immediately, all the fine gifts disappeared, and the woman and her family reverted to their former poverty. Fairies were also believed to be capable of taking children and babies away. In some instances, they were said to replace them with changelings, a substitute for the actual child. The notebook respondent from Limavady, who we've previously heard from, recalls, there was a girl who lived in Slotmanus. One night she went out to the bar, and while she was milking the cows, a number of fairies gathered around her and carried her away. Her parents searched the countryside and could not find her. They'd given up all hope of finding her, when one night, exactly a year later, she came in from the bar at the usual time with a pail of milk in her hand, unaware and unwilling to believe that she had ever been away from home. Next, we have a story involving the fairies that happened on Halloween night. The Limavady notebook respondent recounts, one Halloween, a hunchback from Moreau was passing the Nag's Lane when he heard the fairies singing and dancing in a nearby field. Interested, he listened to their song. It went Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc. Perturbed by the monotony of the song, he decided to improve it and added "and Thursday" to the theme. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc. Delighted with the innovation of the king of the fairies, removed the hump from the Moreau's hunchback's back. When a hunchback in the neighbouring district of Crindle heard this incident, he decided to try his luck the following Halloween. When he arrived at the lane towards nightfall, he heard their monotonous song, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, and quickly added, and Friday. The fairy king, instead of showing delight, became enraged and placed on him the hump they had removed from the Moreau man the previous Halloween. In his article, Calendar Customs in Ulster Folklife, Volume 9, R.H. Buchanan notes, Halloween was genuinely regarded as a night of ill omen. People would never venture out of the house alone, and if they had to go far, they would always keep to the roads and avoid the paths and shortcuts, lest they be led astray by the fairies. As a protection, they often carried a steel needle, but if a man should chance upon a fairy hose, he should take some dust from his feet and throw it out to them, for then they would be obliged to surrender any mortal they had captured. Stories of abduction are often associated with Halloween, for this was a night of berry revels in the rats, and berry thorns could be seen ablaze with lights. Those abducted were usually young women or musicians, whom the fairies wished to join them in their dances. But children were also vulnerable, and as a protection, salt and oatmeal were rubbed in their hair. Moving on then to card playing and the association of it and the devil. Here we can see a pack of circa 1900 playing cards from the Ulster American Folk Park's Paul Loudon Brown White Star Line collection. Our Limavady notebook respondent tells the following story. They say, a man by the name of Peter lived in Moreau. who preferred to play cards with his money rather than to give it to his needy wife and children. At the start, he would only play a few games each evening, but he gradually became so obsessed with cards that he remained at his friends until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. One night when he was coming home, a stranger asked him where he had been. On informing him that he had been playing cards, the stranger invited him to a game. Despite Peter's effort, the stranger won every game. But instead of becoming more confident, he became more restless with the approaching dawn. At last, he decided he would have to depart, and as he rose, Peter noticed his cloven feet. Knowing that he had been recognised, the devil disappeared into thin air in a ball of fire. Peter had such a fright that he immediately disposed of his cards and gave up gambling. Indeed, the same respondent tells numerous stories about the appearance and subsequent disappearance of the devil. In his next story, he recalls, "There was once a card player who lived in the hills above Ballykelly, and foolishly wasted most of his money on playing cards. Late one night, this man was coming home from playing cards, when just as he was about to cross a stile near home, a man's arm reached out and would not allow him to pass. In despair, he tried to evade the clutching hand, but no matter where he went, the hand followed. He had given up all hope of escaping, when suddenly the church clock struck 12, and the hand vanished, allowing him to progress home without incident. In the morning, his father and mother inspected the field where the incident had occurred and found numerous hoof tracks in the vicinity of the stile. On reporting their findings, the son immediately knew that it had been the devil and had abandoned his evil ways." As we've seen from the ghost stories, it can be easy to be mistaken. This story, again told by the Limavady Notebook respondent, goes as follows. He says, "A man who lived several miles from the town of Limavady visited his neighbour's house one night. During the course of his visit, he was persuaded to play a game of cards. However, one game led to another, and when they had finished, it was very late. On his journey home, with all his winnings, he heard chains rattling behind him. Although he increased his pace, the noise came louder and louder, and he saw a black shape following him. All kind of thoughts raced through his mind, and he came to the conclusion that it was the devil. Thinking that it was the money in his pocket that had attracted the devil, he threw it away, but the noise of the rattling chains still followed. Luckily, he had now reached his garden gate, and he hurried into his cottage as quickly as possible. When he regained his courage, he peeped out the window and to his relief discovered an old black cow with a chain around its neck, grazing peacefully in the garden." The devil could also appear in many forms. Here, the Limavady respondent recalls, "Many years ago, there was a dance held in a hall outside Derry. Towards the end of the dance, a handsome young man asked a girl for a dance. When they were dancing, the girl dropped her handkerchief, and as she stooped down to pick it up, she discovered to her horror that her partner had a club foot. She screamed and then fainted and had to be taken out of the dance hall. When she recovered, she told her experience, but by that time, the handsome young man, alas the devil, had vanished." Some were even believed to possess the powers of the devil. According to the Limavady respondent, over in Donegal, there was a fisherman who was such a drunkard that when his spirits were finished, he drank the salt water. Besides drink, he had several other vices, and some people said that he possessed the power of the devil. When he married it was to an old tinker woman who was like himself. They reared a family of 9 boys who were soon induced to follow their wicked parents' ways. All of a sudden, the fisherman became ill and died, and as they were taking him to the graveyard to be buried, his coffin slid off the hearse and at a small bridge. Several men tried unsuccessfully to replace the coffin, and 3 horses were unable to drag it across the stream. A Christian burial had been denied to him because of his evil. Not to be confused with ghosts, the banshee was another haunting figure which often signalled death. Here we have a depiction of the Banshee of the O'Neills from Shane's Castle from the Ulster Folk Museum's W.A. Green photographic collection. A notebook respondent from Mount Norris in County Armagh in 1958 describes the appearance and purpose of the Banshee as follows. The Banshee is a formless white apparition whose wheel is the most significant feature. The Banshee is said to follow certain families, including my own. This was told to me by a workman, who told me he was not surprised to hear of my father's death, as he had heard the Banshee on 3 successive nights prior to his death. He asked me did I know that we were followed by the Banshee. Apparently he thought it rather a compliment, not something to be afraid of or to hide. The noise the Banshee made was recounted by some. The Limavady notebook respondent recalls, one evening towards dusk, a few brothers were out hunting with their dogs near the Largy. As was customary, they held their dogs in leads until they aroused a rabbit or a hare. All of a sudden, the stillness of the evening was disrupted by a series of low moans in the distance. The dogs immediately snapped their leads and raced towards home. On reaching the house, they growled and moaned to be let indoors. These tactics being unsuccessful, they charged at the door relentlessly, but no one opened the door to allow them in, as the brothers' father had died while they were out hunting. Some described the noise as a wailing rather than a moaning. An oral history interviewee from Newtonards in County Down notes that Martha used to tell us about the banshees. She would put her hand on the Bible and say she saw one, you know. She really believed it. She said it was an old woman with long trailing hair. It would wail and wail, and it would be tearing its hair out. She always believed that was for a death. Others recalled the banshee making a weeping sound. A notebook respondent from Mahara concurs about the banshee's warning call. I was told a story by a Presbyterian gentleman who was born in County Antrim, but who spent his adult life as a prosperous merchant in Mahara. He told me that his neighbour and a friend, who lived a few doors further up the street, was awakened in the early hours of the morning, in the grey dawn of a day in late autumn, by what he believed to be the sound of someone weeping in distress. As this continued, he felt that he should give some aid, so he rose from his bed and looked out the window. On the opposite side of the street, he saw what he believed to be the bent figure of a woman sitting on the footpath. It was still not daylight, and he could not see details clearly. The figure seemed to be wrapped up in a shawl, and there was hair falling over the face. The crying continued with a deeper note of distress, and the man felt he should offer help. Something struck his mind, and checked this impulse, and shivering and easy, he went back to bed. The sequel to this is that when people gathered for the fair, a man from the townland of Ballynock dropped dead, R.I.P., beside his car on the very spot where the figure had been crying. It had been the banshee. Some people considered it a compliment to be followed by the banshee. The notebook respondent from Mount Norris recalls, the banshee is said to follow certain families, including my own. This was told to me by a workman who told me he was not surprised to hear of her father's death, as he had heard the banshee on 3 successive nights prior to his death. He asked me did I know we were followed by the banshee. Apparently it was rather a compliment, not something to be afraid of or to hide. Again, as with many of these cases of the supernatural, not all appearances of the banshee were considered legitimate. Our friend from Limavady recalls, a great number of years ago there was an old woman in Limavady who pretended she was the banshee. As soon as she had finished her work every night, she would go out to the present site of the Killeen Road, dress up and start screaming and moaning. People became very frightened and refused to venture near this area around nightfall. One evening, a stranger in the town found an old woman dressing up in a peculiar costume behind a hedge. On arriving in Limavady, he told a friend of his experience. Immediately he and a number of townsfolk set out, caught, and drove out the old woman out of the district. So aside from trying to avoid all these supernatural elements on Halloween, What else did people do? Turnip carving was a popular custom. Today, many people in Ireland prefer to carve a pumpkin, which is a lot easier to do. But in the past, the turnip was the primary choice for carving in Ireland. This frightening example comes from our photographic collections, and you can see it's got matchstick teeth and marbles for eyes. A notebook respondent from Limavady, not the one we've heard a lot from already, recalls that turnips were hollowed out to look like skulls, and candles were lit inside them, and these were hung on bushes and trees and fences to scare people for a joke. Divination practices were also commonplace at Halloween, many of which centred around foretelling the identity of a future spouse. This photograph is from the Ulster Folk Museum's Dundee McKinney collection and shows Mrs. Effie McKinney in her wedding dress around 1900. A notebook respondent from Enniskillen in County Fermanagh recounts in 1958, "A Halloween, it's a great time for taking a peep into the future. It's possible to find out who will be your future wife or husband. All you have to do is to go at midnight to a lime kiln or a deep, dry well. Bring with you a ball of wool and drop it into the deep hole. Your future wife or husband will roll up the thread and hand the ball back up to you. Another method, which is infallible, is to go into your next neighbour's home and listen at the door. The first name you hear mentioned by the people inside the house will be the name of your future partner. You may go out to the haystack and bring a rake with you. Go 3 times around the stack, raking as you go and chanting, 'Round and round I go, that my future husband I may know. Tall or short let him be, this Halloween I must him see.' And round the stack will walk your future partner. If a girl went into a dark room exactly at the stroke of 12, was seated before a mirror, combing her hair, her future husband would surely look over her shoulder." Cabbages were also used for divination purposes, as this notebook respondent from Keady in County Armagh recalls in 1960. They say, "We went out to the garden in the dark and pulled up cabbages, hoping for a long straight stalk denoting a similar husband or wife. Plenty of soil adhering to the stalk meant money. We also used to place 3 bowls on the kitchen table, one empty, one with clean water, and one with dirty water. We were in turn blindfolded, turned around 3 times, and then advanced to put our hand into one of the bowls, meaning no husband or wife, a clean or a dirty one, as the case might be. Another matrimonial game was to fill our mouths with water and go outside listening at doors in hope of hearing a name, our future spouse." The notebook respondent from Limavady in County Londonderry in 1965, from whom we've previously heard about turnips, recalls, "Trinkets were hidden in the apple cakes. Trinkets were usually a silver 3-penny piece, a button, a wishbone, a plain ring, etc. To the finders, these denoted wealth, no marriage, a wish to come true, and of course the ring finder was the envy of us all, as this meant he or she would marry soon. Unmarried maidens often blew out the lamp, lit a candle, and at 12 o'clock midnight stood fearfully in front of the mirror. If a man's face appeared over their shoulder, it was the face of their future husband. If on the last stroke of 12 no husband appeared, then the devil did." Pranks were another common custom at Halloween. Carts and other farm equipment were frequently swapped and moved about, amongst other things. This photograph comes from the Ulster Folk Museum's Robert John Welsh photographic collection and shows Hugh McGahey and his donkey and cart outside a thatched house in Bushmills in County Antrim. A notebook respondent from Clogher in County Tyrone in 1960 explains, "There was always a lot of tricks played on Halloween night, such as taking a cart from a house where a girl was keeping company with a boy. They would leave the cart at the boy's house to embarrass him when he saw his intended father-in-law or brother-in-law coming to take home the cart, or whatever was taken. Gates, too, were very often taken." The notebook respondent from Limavady in County Londonderry in 1965, meanwhile, recounts, "Many pranks were played at Halloween, And I've heard tell of such things as young lads climbing up some neighbour's thatch roof and putting a wet bag over the chimney top, or perhaps tying the end of a reel of black thread to someone's door knocker, lying doggo at a safe distance, and every so often pulling the thread. This lifted the knocker, and it fell with a bang. Many an old soul was kept trotting to the door on a Halloween night by this method. Sometimes pranks got out of hand. As one notebook respondent from Crossgar in County Down in 1959 notes, Halloween was a great time for doing pranks on people, especially ones that were easily annoyed. One of these was roping the door and running away when the door was closed, doing the same over again, keeping the inmates in a stew. Another one, worse, was putting squibs into the house. There was a case of this sort happened not far from here. A few boys came in late from another carry-on, and to finish the night went to a lone woman's house and put squibs below the door, setting fire to a mat. If it hadn't been for the good work of a neighbour, very likely she would have been burned to death. The boys were caught and prosecuted. As you could imagine, a graveyard could be a scary place to be, most certainly at Halloween. This photograph from the Ulster Folk Museum's W.A. Green photographic collection shows the graveyard at Temple Craney Church in Portaferry in County Down. A notebook respondent from Larne in County Antrim recalls in 1960, we heard wonderful stories about the different graves in the churchyard surrounding the parish church, which was just across the street from where we lived. One little child who was buried there died of poisoning from eating berries which grew along the church wall. Juniper berries, I think they were called. The child's mother was helping the rector when the harvest festival decorations, and when she was busy, the child wandered out of the church, and the bright red berries no doubt attracted him, and he ate them, caused great sensation, and more or less spoiled the festival. An old miser was buried in another grave, and his ghost was supposed to wander through the churchyard every night, as he couldn't rest for thinking of all the good that he might have done with his money. In another grave, a young woman lay, who was supposed to have been smothered between feather bed by her sister-in-law, who did not want the slur of insanity to descend upon her own 5 children by having the young woman confined in a mental home. As the nights get longer and colder, I thought it might be nice to finish off with a recipe from a Hallowe'en supper shared by a notebook respondent from Portadown in County Armagh in 1959. They recount, the apple pudding was a special Halloween supper. The pudding ingredients were boiled potato, flour and apples with sugar. The potatoes were bruised down with a tin into what we would call mashed potatoes. Some flour was mixed and 3 or 4 cakes rolled out fairly thin. First, 1 cake was placed in the pot. Then a layer of cut apples was laid down. This was covered with a second cake. Then more cut apples and another cake. This could be continued for another layer or so. Then the pot is put in the fire and a good supply of live coals kept on the pot lid. Roughly about an hour was necessary for cooking. When it cooked, it would be well stirred and served on plates with a kind of custard. Our Halloween programme at the Ulster Folk Museum is just about to kick off. It's scheduled to run from the 29th to the 31st of October and includes turnip carving demonstrations, you can see here, cabbage reading and food tasting, including Kilcannon, barmbrack and apple pie. So my last slide here, just if anyone's interested in finding out more about the Ulster Folk Museum, you can do so by visiting www.ulsterfolkmuseum.org. If you'd also be interested in finding out more about our library and archive holdings, you can visit our National Museums NI account, which is www.nationalmuseumsni.org/library-archives, and there'll be more information about our holdings. And finally, if anyone wants to contact me directly, I can be contacted on my email address, which I've got here, which is victoria.miller@nationalmuseumsni.org. So I'd just like to finish off by thanking Elizabeth for asking me to speak again today about some of our holdings in the archives relating to Halloween traditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. That was amazing. Some of them are really spooky, and then some of them are kind of sad, and the moral implications, of the gambling and stuff. I was struck with the similarity of to some of the stories that we have. I know Loftus Hall, like there's a very famous one about the devil playing cards, and when somebody dropped a card and looked down, they saw the cloven foot, and then he went up through the roof. So we have some of the stories in common. And then that last one was very tragic about the sister-in-law, who murdered her sister-in-law, who maybe had something wrong with her. And of course, we know that people sometimes with learning disabilities or physical ailments, were hidden away, at best. So you could be quite vulnerable, in a society like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of brings it to life. If you ever are at the folk museum, you can sort of picture people maybe around a fireplace in one of the houses, recounting tales, passing them down. So, maybe hearing it from someone else or reading it in a book and then putting their own twist on it. So it's
Yeah.
quite interesting, to see, people recounting stories that they've heard from someone else and kind of how it gets passed down through time.
Yeah.
Sometimes within the archives, you might see a similar story, but just recounted in a slightly different way and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a really useful resource to have. And we are, wanting to kind of promote, our holdings in the library and archives. We're working really hard behind the scenes, my colleagues in the libraries and archives team, in terms of increasing visibility, better cataloguing, more digitization, so that people then know, that those resources are there for people to access. If you're a researcher or just
Hmm.
somebody, a member of the public who's interested to know, what we have in our archives,
And
that complements the rest of the island.
yeah, and so that was it's interesting that it's the 9 counties of Ulster, which is great, the full province, but also you said, Victoria, that there was kind of two separate collections, that the notebooks went out, it looks like in the 60s. Was the other stuff earlier? And had it anything to do, I know in the Republic they did, maybe was it 38 or 39 and then 45 again, they sent home questionnaires with
Yeah,
school kids, so was that the same thing?
it seems to be. We do have a small collection of what would be known as the schools collection. We have a couple of boxes, but it doesn't seem to cover the whole of Ulster. But there's a
Okay.
proportion that's very similar to the schools collection that you can access online.
Hmm.
And then our collectors books, which I mentioned, yes, the it seems to be a skew to sort of the 6 counties, and then less so, of Donegal, Monaghan, and Cavan.
Hmm.
Maybe just because they were farther away, from where Cultraw is located. But
Yeah.
again, they're similar in that style, as you saw on that slide with the image I showed of, like, sometimes there's little drawings within them, and other times it's more
Yeah.
handwritten. And they seem
Yeah.
to be written by adults. So where the schools collection looks like, obviously written by school children, maybe
Hmm.
interviewing their parents and grandparents about the past. This is more coming from an adult talking about,
Hmm.
their lives in their locality, either writing individually or sometimes as part of a group. Sometimes it might be like a women's organization or maybe a church organization, and they're kind of collectively writing a notebook.
Hmm.
And yeah, this was all kind of taking place around the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the folk museum was being sort of formulated, and sort of the aim was to open the museum in 1964. So
Hmm.
it's all this information gathering, really, kind of collecting those memories that were still in existence in that sort of mid 20th century, because
Yeah.
the nucleus of the Ulster Folk Museum, what we present in the open air museum, is early
Yeah.
1900s living, sort of pre First World War. So all of that information gathering was really important then to help inform how the museum ultimately looked. And then
Yeah.
the Sonic Archive I referenced as well. That was sort of going from strength to strength, especially in the 70s and the 80s and so forth. Sort
Hmm.
of after the notebooks sort of flowed, then the sound archive, and we still collect stories today.
Oh,
But
good.
there was a real prevalence, in the 70s and 80s and so forth, as the museum was developing.
Yeah.
A lot of field work was carrying out then.
Yeah.
Slightly less so today, mainly just we're a smaller team, but we do still collect
Hmm.
interviews on different things and topics, depending on what's of interest or what we're working on and things like that.
Hmm.
So it's good that it's still like an active, resource for people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, sorry, you said some of them are available online, kind of.
Well, yeah, I would definitely direct people first and foremost to the website there about
Archives.
libraries and
Yeah.
archives. And
Hmm.
then the aim is we haven't got that just to that level yet, but the aim will be that some of our archives and so forth will be searchable online and maybe
Hmm.
hopefully eventually digitized and made available online as well. So that's
Okay,
the
great.
longer term aim. But
Yeah.
definitely my colleagues in the libraries and archives team, if anyone did have queries from farther afield, they could definitely help them out. If they were interested in accessing what we held or we
Hmm.
hold, they can reach out to them,
Hmm.
and hopefully they'd be as accommodating as possible. If
Hmm.
people weren't able maybe necessarily to visit in person.
Absolutely. And Victoria, just anticipating the question that I think we might get at this side, and I probably know the answer. Am I right in thinking like you wouldn't have really, in the more recent surveys or that you've sent out, do they ever collect information about the Troubles, or no, like this was purely folk customs and beliefs and that kind of
It
thing?
was primarily, Elizabeth, just
Mhm.
all about the sort of the folklore and side of things.
Mhm.
We would also have, I didn't touch on them today, but we also have a large collection of questionnaires that again went out to
Oh, good.
people on different
Hmm.
topics. But on
Hmm.
none of those, there's over maybe about over 50 questionnaires that went out on different things, but none of them touched upon the Troubles.
Right.
That would the core of that would lie primarily at the Ulster Museum.
Okay.
So we have the Troubles and Beyond gallery there. And
Oh
my
yeah.
colleagues at the Ulster Museum would do again oral history, active collecting, around people's memories of the Troubles.
Hmm.
So again, if you check out the Ulster Museum's website, there's actually a very timely over the last week or so, there's a new online resource, sort of a digital online exhibition about the Troubles,
Oh,
that you
great.
can watch and access on the Ulster Museum's website. And there's various videos and interviews with people about their
Hmm.
memories. So
Mm.
they actively collect as well. We're under the same umbrella as such, but that would fall under the Ulster Museum
Okay.
team. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is more like agricultural practices. Maybe there's a little bit about the Great Hunger uh up
Yes.
there. Yeah. So
The
like
odd
it's
time you'll
great
get
to
things
have
like the
that.
Night of the Big Wind, all that kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
thing. Mostly it's all around sort of the customs and traditions of like the ways of people of Ulster
Yeah.
circa 1900-ish is sort of our key area. But
Yeah.
within the Sound Archive, if people were interviewed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there is
Mhm.
elements where people do reference the Troubles, maybe not a direct interview based on it, but people will bring that into their
Yeah.
experience because it's something that they have experienced in their lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
And have you seen, Victoria, just this will be my last question. I wonder, like, is there a difference between what might be kind of having come out of Scottish traditions or superstitions? Like, are there slight differences? The Banshee, like, obviously is a very famous Irish one, but are there Scottish influences, do you think, in some of these folk beliefs, or has that kind of not been noticed because it was all Celtic?
Yeah, I haven't directly noticed. Like it might be through with some of the recipes maybe coming
Mm.
over. If there was any references to say oats being
Oats.
used in different things like that. Because
Yeah.
my colleague actually at the minute she's looking quite heavily into our Harnenstan collection, and the
Okay.
precursor to those were breadstones. And
Mm.
again, there are references, sort of Scottish references to breadstones. I think Eston Evans makes connection to breadstones and Harnenstans, maybe having a Scottish connection as an example
Mm.
of something that's sort of material culture. So
Hmm.
potentially, yes. And we also find in some of the vernacular building traditions represented in the folk museum, there does seem to be in some of the houses either sort of English or Scottish influence, from the plantation era, coming through into how the buildings were actually constructed. So
Yeah,
there is
even the
sort of
tie
influence
on
there.
the thatch looked different, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are, and again, you might find that, that the farther you would dig into the topic, obviously I've maybe taken a sample, of over in the notebooks as an example. I think we've over 50 or 60 of them, and I've maybe looked at, up to 10 maximum. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think the further you would go, the more likely you'd come across those uh examples. I'm
yeah.
not, don't quote me now, but I think I saw something online recently about the cabbage divination, and it
Oh,
maybe, I think I saw a reference, but it was a Scottish example of it.
Yeah.
So again, that might be,
It's
someone
funny, I'd
passing
never heard
over.
of the cabbage. We use the peel of an
Yeah,
apple or the peel of a potato. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
I think I just saw, I can't remember where I saw it there, but I saw it a few days ago and I thought, oh, that's similar to what we would have in our
Yeah.
archives. So whether that's something that again just gets brought over by somebody and then it
Yeah.
sort of starts a bit of a trend. But yeah, it's a bit of an odd one with the
Yeah,
cabbage
good. Well, it
divination.
sounds
So
like your program is going to be amazing over the next few days. So you'll have like school kids and visitors and all of that driving
yeah,
through.
well,
Hmm.
we're on half term at the minute, so the schools
Okay.
are normally on their break. But then, what happens then is usually the parents will bring the children and stuff. So it is quite a
Mhm.
family orientated
Yeah.
day. As I say, we've got various things on like food tasting. Our first person interpreters are putting on a murder mystery
Oh,
on
nice.
site, things like that that
Good, good.
just help to bring the site alive
Yeah.
just to around that time of year. So that would be our key times of year would be seasonal. So
Okay.
Halloween, then Christmas, Easter and May Day,
Hmm.
harvest, all those types of
Yeah, very
times of year,
rural.
St. Patrick's Day, all
Yeah,
very kind of popular days when people are off school or off work
that's
and then they come
fantastic.
and
Yeah.
experience the museum. So
And it's funny, isn't it, how big Halloween got? Like D Derry have a huge, Halloween kind of festival now too, and Galway. So yeah,
yeah,
of
it's
course we
massive.
invented Halloween, so it's good that we're taking advantage of it at home.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's
Yeah,
lots on nowadays, isn't there? So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
lots to see.
So listen, thank you so much, Victoria. I think we're coming back. I can't even remember what our next talk will be together, but I know we have a series kind of planned, so I'm really looking forward to that. And maybe we'll look at some language, issues sometime as well, and other cultural and community-based kind of things. So we'll be in touch and keep an eye out for the series. But thank you very much, and happy Halloween to you.
Happy Halloween. Thank you.
Good, good. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.